Elliot Gray sat at his desk in the dim glow of his desk lamp, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen. The room was quiet, save for the occasional groan of the old radiator and the muffled hum of traffic below his apartment window. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The cursor blinked again and again, but no words came. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly through his nose. His eyes drifted across the cluttered desk, stacks of half-filled notebooks, dog-eared paperbacks, pens that no longer worked, and a to-do list scribbled weeks ago with the first item reading, "Write something, anything." He had always told himself that he would write a novel. Ever since he was 16, it was the dream. Not just a hobby, not just a hope, a destiny. Yet at 32, Elliot had written dozens of first pages and zero endings. Each attempt fizzled under the weight of his expectations, crushed by the inner voice that whispered, "This isn't good enough." He glanced at his phone. No new messages. Clara hadn't texted back. Maybe she was asleep. Maybe she was just tired of hearing him say the same things over and over again. "I just need more time. I'm close to figuring it out. I can't write when I'm this stressed." Excuses wrapped in just enough sincerity to sound reasonable. Clara had heard them all. She'd been patient, supportive. Too supportive, maybe. Elliot had learned how to talk about writing so well that he often fooled even himself into thinking he was working. But he wasn't. Tonight was no different. Another evening lost to distraction, doubt, and an overwhelming pressure to create something perfect. The door creaked open behind him. Elliot turned to see Clara, barefoot and wrapped in her oversized cardigan, standing in the doorway. Her hair was messy, her eyes tired. "Still at it?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Trying." She stepped into the room, her gaze drifting over the desk, the untouched keyboard, the same blinking cursor. "You should get some sleep," she said. "It's late." "Yeah," he murmured, rubbing his temples. "I will. Soon." She came over, kissed the top of his head, and lingered a moment. "I know it's hard, Elle, but you can't keep doing this to yourself." He looked up at her, meeting her eyes. "Doing what?" "Living in your head, chasing something without ever letting yourself be okay with the process. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real." Her words sat with him long after she left the room. He stared at the screen, then down at his notebooks, then back at the screen. He placed his fingers on the keyboard, and then, for the first time in months, he typed a sentence. Not a brilliant one, not an original one, but it was his, and it was on the page. The next morning broke with soft gray clouds and the smell of rain still hanging in the air. Elliot awoke on the couch, the laptop balanced precariously on his lap, a few hundred words etched into the digital void. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Clara had left a note on the coffee table. "Breakfast at Lila's. You know where to find me. Don't get lost in your head." See double quote. Elliot smiled despite himself. Lila's was their Sunday ritual, even if it was now Tuesday. He pulled on a sweater, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the drizzle. The streets of Astor Hill were quiet, puddles forming along the curbs. Lila's cafe stood on the corner, all ivy-covered brick and fogged-up windows. Inside, Clara sat by the window, her hands curled around a fresh mug of coffee. "You came," she said as he slid into the booth across from her. "I needed air." "And pancakes," he grinned. "Obviously." They ate in relative silence, the kind that comes from familiarity rather than awkwardness. Elliot wanted to tell her he'd written something, but he was afraid speaking it aloud might break the fragile thread of progress. Instead, she asked, "Do you remember the cabin your dad used to take you to? The one by the lake?" He blinked. "Barely. I was 10 the last time we went." "Maybe you should go back." "To the cabin?" "To the beginning." Elliot shook his head. "It's been abandoned for years." "Then it's waiting." He stared out the window, watched the raindrops trace crooked paths down the glass. The idea unsettled him, but it also sparked something, faint, flickering. He paid the bill before she could argue, and as they stepped back into the drizzle, she handed him a small notebook. "In case the words come before you get home." That night, Elliot sat at his desk again. He stared at his father's painting, the boy on the cliff. And for the first time, he didn't feel like the boy was falling. He felt like he was choosing to jump. Elliot drove north under a sky painted in bruised blue and melancholy gray. The cabin by the lake was 4 hours away from the city, nestled among towering pines and memories he had long buried. The road grew more uneven with each passing mile, the trees closing in like a cathedral of silence. He hadn't told Clara he was going. Something about saying it out loud made it too real. But the notebook she gave him sat on the passenger seat, unopened, as if waiting for its turn to speak. By the time he reached the turnoff, dusk had set in. The path was overgrown but familiar. Muscle memory guided him through the last half mile until the cabin emerged, weathered, sagging, but still standing. Elliot stepped out, boots crunching against damp leaves. He stood in front of the door for a long time before pushing it open. The scent of old wood and dust hit him like a wave. Inside, nothing had changed. A few cobwebs, an overturned chair, the fireplace still filled with ash. He dropped his bag and walked to the back room, the studio. His father's easel still stood in the corner, a canvas stretched across it, covered by a faded sheet. Elliot hesitated, then pulled it back. A half-finished painting greeted him, a boy rowing across a lake, eyes fixed on the horizon. The brushstrokes were bold yet uncertain, like someone trying to remember something too important to forget. Elliot sank to the floor. The silence pressed in, but this time it felt different. Not empty, expectant. He pulled out the notebook and began to write. The lake remembers, even when we do not. Later he lit a fire and sat in its glow, thumbing through old sketchbooks he found in a drawer. Most were filled with studies of nature, others of a boy, him, laughing, reading, dreaming, pages and pages of a son seen through the eyes of a father. It brought tears. That night Elliot dreamed of the lake, of himself as a child, rowing towards something he couldn't see but felt in his bones, and his father's voice, faint, carried on the wind. Keep going. Don't stop until you understand. Elliot woke with purpose. The fire had gone out, but he felt a flicker of warmth inside. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He picked up the notebook and kept writing. The next day dawned crisp and silent. Mist curled over the surface of the lake, like breath on glass. Elliot stood at the edge of the dock, wrapped in his father's old flannel jacket, watching the world come alive, one ripple at a time. He remembered mornings like this, though faintly, his father sketching quietly on the porch, the gentle scrape of charcoal on paper, and Elliot skipping stones across the still water. Those memories had always felt like someone else's life. Now they felt closer. Inside, he made coffee the way his father used to. Black, no sugar, bitter as truth. He sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and began drafting a new chapter. Not of his book, but of himself. He wrote about the quiet strength of his father's presence, the way he rarely spoke but always saw. He wrote about the fear that silence had buried secrets, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the silence was its own kind of language. That afternoon, Elliot hiked the trail behind the cabin, the same one they used to take to the overlook. It was overgrown, stubborn with thorns and roots, but the path was still there. At the summit, the lake stretched out below like a mirror to the sky. He sat on the edge and pulled out the sketchbook he'd found in the cabin. He flipped to a page he hadn't seen before, a portrait of him as a teenager, lost in thought, his eyes distant. His father had written in the margin, "He doesn't see it yet, but he shines." Elliot felt the ache of it, the longing, the love, the distance. He closed the sketchbook and let the breeze carry away a few tears. When he returned to the cabin, he found a message on his phone. Clara, I hope the silence is being kind to you. Come back when you're ready. Or not. Just don't disappear. He stared at it for a long time before replying, I'm not lost. I'm just remembering. That night, he sat by the fire and wrote until his hand cramped. And for the first time, he didn't think of the story as something he owed to his father. He thought of it as a gift to himself. Elliot stood at the threshold of the attic, a narrow pull-down ladder creaking under his weight as he climbed into the dust-thick air above the cabin. The scent of cedar and thyme greeted him like an old song, unsettling, strangely familiar. Shafts of light pierced through cracks in the roof, illuminating floating specks of dust that moved like ghosts in the stillness. He hadn't been up here since he was a boy. Back then, the attic had felt enormous, full of secrets. Now it was just a small, forgotten room cluttered with relics. Old trunks, moth-eaten blankets, yellowing boxes. One trunk sat near the back, covered in a faded tarp. It had his father's initials burned into the wood, J.G., and Elliot knew, even before opening it, that this would be where the story waited. Inside were dozens of canvases, some wrapped, others left exposed. He carefully lifted each one. They were studies of the lake, self-portraits, landscapes in different seasons. But nestled between two canvases was a bundle of letters, tied with fraying twine. The paper was soft, the ink faded. Some were addressed, others not. One, at the very top, bore his name. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. "Dear Elliot, I've never known how to speak to you. Not truly. Maybe that's why I paint, because silence was always easier. But silence also stole things from us, and I don't want it to take this too." The letter went on, not poetic or polished, just raw, honest. His father admitted to his fears, his doubts, the weight of being both artist and father. He spoke of missed chances, pride he'd never voiced, love he didn't know how to express. By the end, Elliot could barely see the page. He read more letters, some to Elliot, some to his mother, some to no one. Each one pieced together fragments of a man Elliot thought he'd never understand. The quiet wasn't avoidance, it was fear. The distance wasn't neglect, it was confusion, uncertainty, grief. That night, Elliot didn't write. He sat by the fire and reread every letter, again and again. He imagined his father writing them in the dead of night, hoping that someday, somehow, Elliot would find them. In the quiet of the cabin, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full, full of things unsaid, but never unfelt. And for the first time, Elliot whispered into the space around him, "I see you now, Dad." The fire cracked, the wind stirred, and the story inside him began to shift, from tribute to truth. The morning after reading the letters, Elliot rose before the sun. He stepped outside barefoot, the earth cool beneath his feet, and watched as the first blush of dawn crept over the lake. It was quiet in that sacred way early mornings are, a hush that asked for reverence, not speech. With a mug of black coffee in hand and the letters folded neatly in his pocket, he wandered down to the dock and sat with his notebook in his lap. The pages fluttered in the breeze like the wings of something newly woken. He didn't write at first. He just listened, to the water lapping gently against the wood, to the birds beginning their tentative song, to the echo of his father's voice, not in words but in presence. The cabin, the lake, the sketches, the letters. They were all pieces of a language Elliot was just starting to understand. When he finally picked up his pen, the words came unforced. "I used to think silence was the enemy, that it meant absence, emptiness. But now I think it's where the truth hides, waiting for us to be quiet enough to hear it." He paused, then added, "I was afraid of what I wouldn't find, but I think I was more afraid of what I would." Later, while digging through the kitchen drawers in search of an old can opener, Elliot found a cassette player. It was dusty and half broken, but the buttons still clicked. There was a single tape inside, unlabeled. He hesitated before pressing play, crackling static. Then a voice, raspy, uncertain. "Elliot, if you're hearing this, I guess I didn't say things when I should have." It was his father. The recording was unpolished, almost awkward. There were long silences between sentences, as if he were searching for the courage to keep going. "I don't know what kind of man you'll grow up to be. I just hope you're kinder to yourself than I ever was to me, and that you find your voice, even if it's not made of paint or poems or whatever I thought art had to be." Elliot sat frozen. The words weren't groundbreaking. They didn't wrap everything in a neat bow. But they were his. His father had tried. That night, Elliot built a fire outside and set the tape recorder beside him. He looked up at the stars peeking through the trees. He imagined his father sitting there too, paint under his fingernails, watching the sky for answers. Clara called. He didn't pick up. Instead, he texted, "I'm almost ready. Just need to finish hearing him." Clara replied almost immediately. Then I'll be here. When you are. Elliot smiled. That night, he didn't write a single word. But somehow the story kept growing. The rain came on Elliot's last morning at the cabin. Not heavy, but steady, like the world was exhaling. He stood at the window, coffee warming his hands, watching droplets race each other down the glass. Everything felt slower now, softer. The lake, the forest, the echoes of his childhood. They no longer haunted him. They had become part of him, and in some small, powerful way, he had become part of them. He packed in silence. Every object he touched seemed to hold a memory. His father's jacket draped over the chair, the sketchbook resting by the fireplace, the empty mug still ringed with coffee at the table. He didn't take much, just the letters, the sketchbook, the tape, and the notebook he had nearly filled. Before locking the door, he stepped into the studio one last time. The unfinished painting of the boy in the boat still stood on the easel. Elliot stared at it for a long moment before picking up a pencil from the desk. His hand trembled slightly as he sketched something simple but deliberate. A sun rising on the far edge of the horizon. A sign of hope. A promise of return. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. As he drove back toward the city, the roads felt less foreign. He passed old gas stations, forgotten diners, childhood landmarks turned ghosts, and instead of avoiding their gaze, he acknowledged them, honored them. When he reached the apartment, Clara was waiting on the steps, arms crossed, eyes cautious but hopeful. He stepped out of the car and didn't speak, just walked to her and pulled her into a long, quiet hug. "You came back," she whispered. "I had to finish the story," he said, "and I realized it didn't end there." She smiled into his chest. It never really ends. It just changes. Inside, Elliot opened his laptop. The blinking cursor greeted him again. But this time, it didn't feel like a challenge. It felt like an invitation. He began typing. "My father lived in silence, but he left behind a world that spoke louder than he ever could. In his absence, I found my presence. In his unfinished paintings, I found a path to my own story. And in the quiet, I found the voice I thought I'd lost." Day after day, Elliot wrote. The words flowed, not easily, but truthfully. He wrote about the boy on the cliff, about the lake, about silence and guilt and grief and grace. He wrote about a father who couldn't say what he felt, and a son who finally learned to listen. Months later, when he typed the final sentence, Clara sat beside him, reading each page like it mattered more than air. When he finished, she looked at him through tear-filled eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's you." He nodded. "It's us. Him. Me." The manuscript was titled "The Space Between Words." Elliot sent it to his editor with a note. "This isn't the story I planned to write, but it's the story I needed to." And then he closed the laptop, stepped outside, and let the late spring air kiss his face. Somewhere deep inside, the silence remained, but it no longer hurt. It held him. It held everything.